Okay, we're at the second chapter of Tanya. Our tour through the first perek has been very, very exciting, very novel, very new, and hopefully we'll have as much success in the subsequent chapters. So the first part of the second chapter of Tanya, we'll break it into pieces. Hopefully we'll cover a piece a week. The summary of this portion is as follows. We spoke in the previous chapter about the elemental soul, what Rabbi Chaim Vital calls the soul of the elements, what the Tanya calls the natural soul or the animal soul. And now we're learning in the second chapter, we're talking about the divine soul, the godly soul, the second soul. And of course, why is it called second? Because it enters the body after the first one. A person is born with their elemental soul intact, but the divine soul creeps in only slowly after a while. It starts when the baby's given its name, for a boy at the bris and for a girl at the Torah reading. When it receives its Jewish name, then the soul begins to creep in, and slowly it creeps until the bar or bas mitzvah, when the soul enters completely. The Alter Rebbe will spend the first portion of the second chapter demonstrating that this soul is actually fully divine, a piece of Hashem. And of course, this is based on many sources, many sources from other Sfarim, from other books. The Alter Rebbe is not making this up. I'll try to show. Here we go. That wasn't right. The Alter Rebbe is bringing up a theme that was expressed by many Kabbalah books before him. Here, I put it up here. Do you see it? You see how many? You see how many original ancient Kabbalah texts have this idea of Chelik Elokah Mimal, that the divine soul is a piece of God from above. That's the Das Tvunas. I don't know where that's from. Here, Chelik Elokah Mimal, the Jewish soul is all again Das Tvunas and again Das Tvunas. Tanya, you have it, of course, the Alshich. On the Torah, he says the Jewish people, they are a piece of Hashem from above. And the Shnei Luchos HaBris, the Shaloh, says, we already said that the Neshama is a Chelik Elokah Mimal, a piece of God from above. And we have the Sheshanas HaAmokim. Again, Lefiza Lama Shanab Shesenu, that our souls are Chelik Elokah Mimal Heina, that they are a veritable piece from above. So on, V'naf Shesam from the Rimmiskel, Chelik Elokah Mimal. And from Shadal, I don't know who that is, Chelik Elokah Mimal. That's a commentary on Iyov. And so on and so on and so on. This idea that the Jewish soul, the divine soul inside the Jew is a piece of Hashem from above, is a Chelik Elokah Mimal, is an idea that's very, very well known and very well expressed through all the books of Kabbalah. There are several places where the word mamash is used, because the Alter Rebbe emphasizes that the second soul, Nefesh Hashem is b'Yisrael, Chelik Elokah Mimal mamash. The second soul in the Jew is a veritable, a true piece of God from above. And the Alter Rebbe is emphasizing the word true, because as we'll see, hyperbole in Torah is possible. So let's dive into the texts, the sources, and build out the second chapter of Tanya from the sources. The first source, this idea of Chelik Elokah Mimal, comes from Iyov, from Job, in the 31st chapter, where Iyov is making an argument that he has not sinned and that the punishments are coming to him, and he suffered terribly. These punishments are not coming to him because of his iniquitous behavior, because of his sinfulness. He says he has no sin, and he has a whole chapter 31 arguing that he is confident that he has no sin to his credit. In very, very jarring language, he dares Hashem to take him to a proper accounting. He challenges Hashem to make a proper record of his behavior, and that Hashem would see that there is no sin there. And after a whole book of his friends arguing with him, that's really what the book of Iyov is. They're arguing with him about theology. Because of his suffering, he has a very, very deep discussion with his friends about theology. And in this final chapter, he argues this final argument: I have not sinned. And then why am I being punished so profoundly? And at this point, his friends have no answer. They have no answer. So let's read these 4 verses from the book of Iyov, chapter 31. It says, Bris karati liyenoi, I have made a covenant with my eyes, not to look, and Rashi says, not to look at married women, umo esbeinin al besula, and not to gaze for too long at an unmarried woman. You're allowed to look at an unmarried woman to make an assessment, if she'll be your wife or if she'll be a wife to your sons. But to spend too much time looking, Iyov said, I made a covenant with my eyes not to even do that. Now, what is the reward that Hashem has given from on high? And what portion has Hashem given from his high places? Isn't suffering for somebody who has sinned, and misfortune to those who do terrible things. Does God not see my ways? And he's counted all my steps. So here, we don't see this clearly in the commentaries, but certainly not in the commentaries of Tanya. But this second verse that has in it chelek eleka mimal is not describing the soul necessarily. What is it describing? It's describing the reward and punishment for good behavior and for bad behavior. What portion will Hashem reward those who do good and those who do evil? However, it could be a clue. You can find a clue here for the second soul in the Jew, in the Jewish body. We already said that the Jewish body has a soul in it. Yeah, that the body is the garment for the animal soul or the natural soul. That the body and the natural soul together are a garment for higher and higher lights, spirits, souls, and so on. But this verse, is a description of a possible partner, because you could say that it's related to the verse that came before. The verse that came before says, I made a deal that I'm not looking at married women because I have no use for a married woman. I can't marry her. Sounds a little crass the way I said it. That's not what it means. It means that a married woman is not mine to look at. An unmarried woman, I look at her to see if it's a possible shidduch, if it's a possible partnership. And based on that, you say, then this is the question of the second verse. Is this the portion? When I'm looking at the unmarried girl, I'm saying, is this the portion that Hashem has granted me to be my partner? And on this verse, all the Kabbalah books that I showed you, they all take that phrase, chelek elika mimal, and they translate it as a veritable piece of God from on high, and they say, this second soul is going to be my partner in life. That's a possible explanation that I didn't see anywhere, but I understand it that way. We have a description of this divine soul in the Shari Kedusha from Chaim Vital, and I want to read it. I didn't translate it in the text. I'll do that Mitzvah Hashem after class, and then you can come back and review the source sheet on Sefaria.org. But I want to read it and translate it for you in the Hebrew, because based on this is the foundation of the Alter Rebbe's argument. that the second soul of the Jew is a literal piece of Hashem from on high. Gam nisbayer, it can also now be understood, gedulas haneshama, the greatness of the soul, ki hu oir misialet v'nimshach me'oir ha'esesfiras atman, because it is a light that is birthed and that comes from the light of God's own 10 divine attributes themselves. Shelo yalidei emtzoi, not through any intermediary, not through any process. V'lazeh nikru, and that's why the Jewish people who contain this soul, who have this soul in themselves, are called bonim atem la'Hashem elekechem. You are children to Hashem, your God. Ki heim b'v'chinas keben, ki heim b'v'chinasam, because the way we are with this divine spirit direct from Hashem inside of us, we are keben, like a child, mis'ached beyoviv betachlis, very much attached to our parents. V'nimshach mimenu, and we come from the parent. V'zehu soid, and that's the mystical secret of ha'avos hein hamerkava, that the patriarchs Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov were a chariot. They were a chariot to the light of Hashem. El oir ha'eses sfiras harechev aleihem, the light of Hashem, of Hashem's own 10 divine attributes that ride upon them in their souls. Shelo yalidei emtzaos, not through any intermediary, not through any other carrier. V'zehu soid, this is also the mystical secret of Yisrael asher boch espire, the Jewish people in whom I pride myself. Ki levush ha'adam, what generally, how does a person pride themselves? How does a person show dignity? Through clothing, the Gemara says. Ki levush ha'adam hu tifarte, the clothing of a person is how he shows his dignity. Ki meshikasav kechasan yechahin pa'er that the bride and the groom are beautified and dignified through their clothing. And so, the light of our souls is a garment to the light of Hashem's divine attributes. And that's the mystical meaning of my beloved has descended to his garden, referring to this world. Why does he come to this world? The verse continues, to walk among the gardens and to collect roses. Those 4 words, lirois beganim velilkot sheshanim, is a Rashi Tevis. It's the acronym for the word levush, which means garments. Why? Ki loiket neshamis hatzadikim, because the light of Hashem is gathering up the souls of the righteous, hamarichim kisheshanim, who smell like roses. They smell so beautiful. They give off such a beautiful fragrance al yedei ma'aseihem b'olam hazeh, through their good deeds in this world. V'loiktam lehislabish eirei bohem, and Hashem chooses the righteous to clothe His own light in them. And this is the secret of atem hadveikim b'Hashem, you who cleave to Hashem. Dibuk gomer im oir ha'eser sfiras. It's a total connection, a total attachment to the light of the 10 sfiras. Masha'in kain b'chol hanivroim. This attachment to the light of Hashem, to Hashem's 10 divine attributes that exists between the soul of a Jew, the divine soul, and the light of Hashem himself, does not exist in any other creation, in any other creature. And that's why it says in the pasuk, Ki kasha yidabek ha'ezer b'masnei ish ken yidbakti eschem elai kol beis Yisrael. There's a special attachment of the Jewish souls to Hashem himself. Of course, as we said before, the Alter Rebbe adds the word mamosh. Mamosh means literally. And the Rebbe points out something very interesting. By adding the word mamosh, the Alter Rebbe had to know that he was creating a contradiction in terms. Because what are we trying to say? The Tzemach Tzedek describes the chelek means a portion, elika means God, mi ma'al. Mi ma'al means extremely high. High, where there's nothing higher than that. The Hebrew word al means above. The Hebrew word al means on. The Hebrew word me'al Mem al means above. Mi me al means higher than above. It's the highest you can go. It's at a place where there is nothing higher than it. That's what it means. Chilek eleka mi ma'al. It's a piece of Hashem from the highest possible place. What's the word mamosh? Mamosh means you can touch it. It's tangible. It's so true you can touch it. It comes from the word mishush, which means touching. So you have these terms that contradict each other. You have the word mi ma'al, which means so high that you can't get higher than that. And then you also have the word mamosh, which means tangible, touchable, down here, below, on earth. So the Rebbe says, of course the Alter Rebbe knew he was creating a contradiction in terms, but that contradiction is the life of a Jew. That's the life of the neshama. When a human being is truly invested in his relationship with Hashem, what happens is, in the morning, he or she is driven like a raging fire to depart from the body and cleave to Hashem exclusively. But at the same time, we know that that's not our purpose in life. That our purpose in life is not to fly away and attach ourselves to Hashem, soul to spirit. No, we have to fulfill our mission here on earth in the physical sense. And the Alter Rebbe was a musical composer. Some of the songs are well known and others are not as well known. But there's one song that the Alter Rebbe composed. It's not actually a song. It's I don't know what it's called in Hebrew. I know what it's called in English. In Hebrew, it's called a tenua. It's one movement of music that goes over and over and over to aid in some meditation. And so the Alter Rebbe composed this movement, this tenua, that reflects this back and forth of the soul, the yearning to be connected with Hashem, and at the same time, the remembering, the realization that we have to be on the earth doing Torah and mitzvahs here. And it goes like this. Keyayil taroi galafike moim vehoyu letoitafois beineinecha. It means, like a gazelle thirsting in a barren desert, but you have to bind the tefillin on your arm. Something like that. On the one hand, the soul is yearning and fighting. I want to be in heaven together with God, back subsumed in the oneness of Hashem, but that's not my job. I have to be here on earth tying tefillin on my arm and on my head. That's the Alter Rebbe's message. And this message is expressed here in this simple contradiction in terms. It's chelek eleka mima'al. The soul of the Jew is the highest thing. But at the same time, we realize that the purpose for the neshama being here is in order to fulfill mitzvahs and make the world a dwelling place for Hashem. Let's see now on the more practical side. The Alter Rebbe adds the word mamosh because it is possible that when we say chelek elika mimal, that the soul is a piece of Hashem, it's very possible that that's just hyperbole. It's just exaggerated talk. And of course, that such exaggerations are found in the Torah. And we have here the Gemara discussing this question. There, the Gemara is saying that the rabbis exaggerate. And the question is, how can rabbis exaggerate? And the answer is, why are you asking how rabbis exaggerate? The Torah itself exaggerates sometimes. Let's take a look. Amar Rabbi Ami, Dibra Torah Loshin Havai. Torah sometimes employs exaggerated language. Dibru Neviim Loshin Havai. The prophets also use exaggerated language. And then he brings us some examples. Dibra Torah Loshin Havai Dechsiv. Torah uses exaggerated language as it says, Orim Gedolos Betzures Bashamayim. The Torah speaks employing exaggerated terms as it says, listen, Israel, you're going to pass over the Jordan River and you're going to go into the land of Canaan to expel nations from their cities, these great cities that are fortified up to the heavens. Says the Gemara, Salkadaitach, Bashamayim Salkadaitach. You think it's true that the cities were fortified all the way up to the heavens? Elo, says the Gemara, Guzma. It's an exaggeration. So in the Torah there is such exaggerations, and therefore the Alter Rebbe chooses, aside from all the homiletical stuff, the Alter Rebbe chooses to use the word mamash, which some Kabbalah books use and others don't. The Alter Rebbe chooses to use that word to emphasize the fact that we're not talking hyperbolically. It's very factual. The soul, the second soul in a Jew, is actually a piece of Hashem. And now it's up to the Alter Rebbe to demonstrate this through various analogies and proofs. So the Alter Rebbe brings us 3 analogies for how a soul could be a veritable piece of Hashem. Number 1, by bringing the example of one who blows, one who's blowing. The soul of man is blown into him, this divine soul. What's the difference between regular breath and blowing? Why is it that a person breathes every moment of their lives? They're breathing and breathing. Yeah, and it doesn't tire a person out. You never get tired from breathing. When you're tired, we're told you have to breathe. But when you blow, you tire yourself out. Because man de nofach, you see this quote from the Zohar, the Alter Rebbe attributes it to the Zohar, but we don't find it in our versions of the Zohar that we have. Anyway, the text is man de nofach mituichi nofach, because blowing comes from much, much deeper. Blowing is the deepest expression of breath that there is. And the fact is, we see in the Torah, Vayitzer Hashem Elikim es Adam Afar min ha'adama, that first God formed man from the dust of the earth, and at this point we are assuming that the elemental soul comes along with the body, like all. Maybe this was before the sin of the tree. So he made the body of man, and then Vayipach bi'apav nishmas chayim, and then he blew. Blowing is the key. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life. All other creations, everything else that was created, Hashem spoke into existence. Speaking is not as exhausting as blowing. Why? Because the question is, how deep is the source of the breath that you are expressing? If the source of the breath is very, very deep, then even a little bit of that expression is going to tire you out quickly. If the depth of that breath is shallow, you can do that for a long, long time and it'll never tire you out. So by describing the entrance of the soul of man into the body of man as being blown in, that's a demonstration that the soul comes from a very, very profound and deep place, as the Alter Rebbe says in Igeres HaTshuva, I think, that it's from the deepest expression of life that Hashem gives to anything. So that's analogy number 1. We find in the Torah that the soul of man is blown into him, and blowing demonstrates a very, very deep root in Hashem himself. Another analogy that the Alter Rebbe uses is that the Jewish people are rooted in Hashem's thoughts. Of the various forms of expression, we have thought, speech, and action. Action is outside the body. The body moves, but action is really how a human being interacts with objects that are beneath him, inanimate objects. I act in order to affect something that cannot understand my words. I speak in order to interact with something or affect someone who does understand my words. I think. Thinking is my own soul talking to me. It's the highest and deepest expression of the self. And we see in the Medrash that the Jewish people are rooted in Hashem's thoughts. Let's read the Medrash. Bereshis bara Elikim, this is Genesis 1:1. In the beginning of God's creation, Shisha Devarim Kadmu Lebrias Ha'olam. 6 things were created before the world was created. How do we get 6 things? Because if you take the word Bereshis, you can break it into two Aramaic words, bara shis, which means he created 6 things, and then the translation of the word bereshis, which means at the beginning. So you can read that sentence as God created 6 things at the beginning of his creation. Yesh mehem shanivru, some of these things were actually created, v'yesh mehem sha'ala b'machshava lihibrois, and some of them arose in his thoughts to create them. And what are those things? So the Medrash says, HaTorah v'hakiseh hakaved nivru. The Torah and throne of glory, the heavenly throne of Hashem, were actually created. How do we know that they were created before the world? Torah minayin. How do we know that the Torah was there? Shenemar Hashem kononi reishis darkei. God made me, the Torah, at the beginning of his way. Made means literally, actually created, and at the beginning. Kiseh hakavod minayin. How do we know that the heavenly throne of glory was created at the beginning? Was actually created? Because it says, Nochim kisach hameyoz, your throne is established as of old. Is established is literal, and as of old, meaning before the world was created. Now, those two things were actually made by Hashem before the world was created. What are the things that were made, that rose in Hashem's thought to create them eventually when their time arrived? They are ha'avos, the patriarchs, v'Yisrael, and the Jewish people, ubeis hamikdash, and the Holy Temple, ushmoi shel Mashiach, the name or the reputation of Mashiach. Why not Mashiach himself? Why the name of Mashiach? Mashiach will be a king, and we know that a king rules by his reputation, by his name, not bodily. The king doesn't bodily rule over anything. He stays in his palace and he issues his decrees. And by the reputation and the awe that his name evokes in the people, that's how he rules. Mashiach will be the greatest king of all, and he will have the most powerful name of all, the most powerful reputation of all. It's more important even than the person that Mashiach will be, whoever he will be. The name of Mashiach is the key to ruling the world and bringing the world to a place of holiness. So those things, those 4, the patriarchs, the Jewish people, the Holy Temple, and the name of Mashiach, they rose in Hashem's thought to create them when their time arrived. Ha'avos minayin. How do we know that the patriarchs arose in Hashem's thought? Shenemar, as it says, ka'anovim ba'midbar. It says, like grapes in the wilderness, and the verse continues, your fathers seemed to me like the first figs. So first figs means that they were at the beginning, and seemed to me means that they were not actually created. They had arisen in Hashem's thoughts. Yisrael minayin, the Jewish people, how do we know that they were created, that they arose in Hashem's thoughts before the world was created? Shenemar zechir adasacha kanisa kedem. Remember your congregation whom you purchased from old. Remember is an expression also of thought, of thinking, and of old means before the world was created. Beis Hamikdash minayin, how do we know that the Holy Temple was thought of, arose in Hashem's thoughts before the world was created? As it says, Kiseh kavod morem merishain. Remember, it says, the throne of your glory on high from the beginning, on high, not practical, not physical, and in the beginning, meaning before the world was created. And lastly, Shmoi shel Mashiach minayin. How do we know that the name of Mashiach was arose in Hashem's thought before the world was created? Because it says, Yehi Shmoi li'olam, may his name exist forever. His name shall be Yinain as long as the sun. Rabbi Huna v'Rabbi Yirmiyah b'Shem Rabbi Shmuel bar Rabbi Yitzchak Amru. These rabbis said in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Yitzchak, Machshavtan shel Yisrael kadma l'chol davar. The thought of the Jewish people arose in Hashem's mind before anything. Mashal, an analogy to this would be lemelech, of a king, shehaya nasei lematerina achas, that he had only one queen, v'lo haya lo mimenu bein, and he didn't have from her a prince, a son. Pa'am achas, one time, nimtza hamelech oiver bashuk, the king was found passing through the marketplace. Omar, and he was saying, Tulu minoloin vekalmin zu libni, take this ink and this quill, purchase them for my son. And everybody was asking, Bain Ainloi, the king doesn't have a son. And he's saying, take this ink and this quill for my son. So they concluded and they said, Hamelech asteroilogus godelu, the king must be a great astrologer. So he must foresee that soon he'll have a son, and that's why he is asking for ink and quill for his son, who will eventually be born. Kach, so too. Ilule shetzofa HaKadosh Baruch Hu, were it not for Hashem's vision that after Esrim v'shisha doros Yisrael asid l'kabel HaTorah, that after 26 generations, that the Jewish people would accept the Torah at Har Sinai. He would not have written the Torah in which it says, command the Jewish people, speak to the Jewish people. That means that the highest thing, the first thing to arise in Hashem's thoughts is the Jewish people. Again, so the Alter Rebbe brings this teaching. The Alter Rebbe doesn't bring the whole Medrash, but the Alter Rebbe does bring the words Yisrael alu b'machshava. The Jewish people arose in Hashem's thought, and the Medrash emphasizes that the Jewish people arose in Hashem's thought before anything else, which means, of course, in Hashem, in the spiritual world, there is no before and after. Before and after is a chronological question. And in a world where time and space does not exist, chronology also doesn't exist. So what does it mean before and after? The question, it means closer to the source, Hashem himself, or farther from the source. And when it says the Jewish people arose in Hashem's thoughts, it means very close to the source, Hashem himself. And when it says that the Jewish people arose first of all in Hashem's thoughts, before anything else, it means that there's nothing higher, closer to the source, Hashem himself, than the soul of the Jewish people. So then, thus you have the second analogy to emphasize the height, the depths, the closeness of the Jewish people, the soul, the second soul, the divine soul in the Jewish body. Do we have any questions so far? Is this clear? Doing a lot of talking.
It's clear, but this is from something I was listening to last night. Why did Hashem need to make us?
That's a different question.
Why?
Right.
Yeah, that's a total different question.
Right. It's an important question, but not related. So we'll have to save it for another time.
Yeah.
The practical sometimes gets in the way of the ethereal.
Yep.
Right now we're just building a theory. Do you have a question, Belinda? Okay. Good. So there's another analogy that the Alter Rebbe employs, the third analogy, and that is that the Jewish people are Hashem's children. We saw this in the Shari Kedusha from Chaim Vital, that he expresses this idea of the attachment of the Jewish soul to Hashem himself is expressed as the parent-child relationship. So let's take a look at two verses that the Alter Rebbe brings to emphasize the connection, the deep bond between the soul of a Jew and Hashem. It says like this: V'amarto el pare, God commands Moses in his introduction to Paroi, where Hashem says, you have messed with my son, and now I'm going to take revenge against your sons. V'amarto el pare, so shall you say to Paroi, Koi Omar Hashem, so says God, Bini b'chayri Yisrael, my firstborn son is Israel, the Jewish people. And another verse where Hashem is talking to the Jewish people, Moshe Rabbeinu is talking to the Jewish people directly. Bonim atem laHashem elekechem, he says, you are children of Hashem your God. And therefore, don't do things that will cause a barrier between yourself and Hashem, the things that Hashem loathes. The Tanya commentaries point out that these three analogies seem to appear in a logical lowest to highest progression, because blowing is a physical example, thinking is a more spiritual example, and children, which emerge from the essence of the parents, is the most spiritual of all. And now the Alter Rebbe takes this idea of being rooted in Hashem's thought, or being the children of Hashem, as meaning, as what? As meaning that we are an actual piece of Hashem himself, because that is the argument that needs to be made here, that the soul of man is literally a piece of God. How do we do that? So we said already that the soul of, that we brought from the Medrash, that the Jewish people arose in Hashem's thoughts. Says the Zohar, what does it mean, Hashem's thoughts? How does Hashem's thoughts work? Says the Tikkunei Zohar, Ant Chakim. The Alter Rebbe doesn't bring this version. I did not find the version that the Alter Rebbe brings. The Alter Rebbe brings a version that says, Ihu Chakim. He is wise. He is wise, but not with known wisdom. This version is Ant Chakim. You are wise, but not with known wisdom. Antu Maven. You are knowledgeable. You are understanding, but not with known understanding. Les loch asar yedia, you don't have a known place. Ela lishtameida tukfach v'chelach l'bnei nosha. The point of these 10 powers that Hashem expresses is in order to make known to man his power, and to show to man how the world is ruled, how the world is run by Hashem in justice and in mercy. The inun tzedek u'mishpat, which are tzedakah and judgment. It's all equal, in line with the behavior of man, and so on and on. The Tikkunei Zohar goes, and we'll read the last line because that's another important one. All of this portrays Koila. All of this portrays lachazah eiches nahig alma, how the world is run. Avalav the is loch tzedek yedia, but not that Hashem has some kind of known attribute of tzedakah. The ihudin, or justice, that is the justice that we know of, judgment. V'lav mishpat yedia dihu rachamim, nor judgment as we know it, which is mercy. V'lav mikol ilein midas klal. Hashem does not have any of these attributes that are attributed to him. He has them inside himself, and he expresses them in a very special way that's unique to him, that's unique to God, that they function in Hashem in a manner that they don't function in any other being. What does that mean? That there is wisdom in Hashem, but not known wisdom. There is understanding in Hashem, but not known understanding. So the Alter Rebbe brings this up in order to emphasize the following, as we said before. When we say that the soul of a Jew is rooted in Hashem's thoughts, that means Hashem himself. Why would we say that? Thoughts is one thing, and the thinker is a separate thing, and the subject matter is a third thing. Why does the thought of God equal God himself? My thoughts don't equal me. Sometimes I think things that are anathema to myself. That's a big word. If this were Scrabble, I would win already. No, says the Alter Rebbe. That's why he brings that source from the Tikkunei Zohar. Hashem's mind, Hashem's attributes, his thoughts, his judgment, his mercy, they don't function the way they do in a human being. It's comparable, but it's not precise. And then the Rambam explains it more elaborately. This is from Mishnah Torah, the laws, the foundations of Torah, 2nd chapter, the 10th halacha. He says like this. And this is something we have to understand very, very well, because it applies to Hashem across the board. Number 10. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He, Makir Amitoi, He knows His own truth, V'yedeya oisei k'moshe, and knows it as it really is. Ve'eino yodeya, He does not know things, B'deya shehi chutz mimenu, with a knowledge that is secondary to Himself, that is some kind of add-on app to His essence. K'moshe anu yodim, the way that we know it, right? We are like a smartphone. There's the phone, and then there's the apps that you add to the phone. So there's the person, and then there are the thoughts that you add, the memory that you add to the computer, or even the tool that you use to retain that memory or to compute the data is separate from the original machine itself. In a human being, that's how it works. There's the human being, and then there's the machine that computes data, and then there's the data itself, and it's all three separate things. But by Hashem, it's not that way. Rambam continues, She'ein onu v'da'atenu echad. We and our minds are not one thing. Aval haboire yisbarach hu v'daite v'chayav echad. God and His wisdom, His mind, and His life, the energy that sustains Him, if you could use that word, He doesn't need to be sustained. He lives by Himself. He lives unassisted, unaided. He and His thoughts and His life are one. Mikol tzad, from every side, mikol pina, from every vantage point, b'chol derech yichud, in every possible way of oneness. She'il mole, because if that were not the case, hoya chai b'chayim, He would live from a life that comes from another source, or He would live from a life that is outside of Himself. V'yedeya b'deya chutz mimenu, and He would know things with a wisdom that is outside of Himself. If that were the case, then hayusham eloikus harbe, then there would be many, many gods. There would be there would be Him and His life, which is a divine power, and His thoughts, that would be a divine power. Ve'ein hadavar came, but that's not how it is. Elo echad mikol tzad mikol pina. Hashem and His life and His thoughts and His wisdom are all completely one from every side and from every possibility, from every possible oneness. Nimtze sa'ata omer, then we must conclude, Hu hayedeya, He is the one who knows the person. If we're using the analogy of the person, or let's use the analogy of a computer, we have the machine, and we have the application in the machine that computes the data, and then we have the data itself. In a machine, it's three separate things. In a human being, it's three separate things. In Hashem, we have to say, Hu hayedeya, He is the one who knows. Hu hayodua, He is the data Himself. He is the data itself. V'hu hadeya atzma, hakol echad. He is the knower, the one who knows. He is the ability to know, and He is the knowledge itself, all as one. V'davar zeh ein koyach bepeh la'omrei. This is something Rambam says, that the human mouth doesn't have the right words to describe it properly. V'lei ba'izem l'shamoi, the human ear cannot hear this and understand it properly. V'lei belev ha'adam l'hakiri al buryav, nor does the heart of man have the ability to understand this properly. This is an absolute oneness of Hashem and His attributes, and that's critical to the argument that the Alter Rebbe is making here today. That by means of the Jewish people ascending, rising in Hashem's own thoughts, that means that they are rooted in Hashem Himself, being that Hashem's thoughts are absolutely 100% one with Himself. This is not something that we can fully grasp. But that's not surprising. There are many things about Hashem that we cannot fully grasp. As it says, two scriptural sources for the fact that we cannot grasp this. Hacheker elikatimtza says, Iyov, would you discover the mystery of God if you would search for it? And the final verse is, Ki loy machshavosai machshavosechem, my thoughts are not your thoughts, v'lei darchechem derochai, nor are my ways your ways. That's what Hashem says to the Jewish people. So this is the first part of Tanya chapter 2. And we have a few extra minutes here at the end. I would like to take your questions, please. And then we'll read through we'll actually read through the Alter Rebbe's version. We built it up from the sources, but it would be what we didn't do in the last chapter. We'll do it now. It's important to go back to the Alter Rebbe's own words and see how they come together. Questions, comments, thoughts, theories? Please.
I have a question. If there's no way for a human being to understand the oneness of Hashem, how is it possible that there are people that have been able to synthesize that idea? How are they able to say God's thoughts and God's ability to think, and how are they able to say that, to put it into words?
You're amazing, Belinda.
Why?
You're amazing.
Thank you.
That is an amazing question. That is a totally amazing question.
Thank you.
So it's a very good question. Rambam didn't say we don't have the ability to understand Hashem's oneness. He says we don't have the ability to understand it completely. But to understand it to a certain degree, every person according to their abilities, we can. Everybody has the ability to understand it to some degree. What we cannot understand, or let's say we could understand it in general terms, but we can't understand it in its specifics. Or what we do have the ability to know, is that Hashem has his true perspective, and we are limited to our perspective, and we're comfortable with that. And we acknowledge on a daily basis that we have our perspective and he has his perspective, and he's right and we're not entirely right. And that's okay.
I mean, how do you describe a color to a blind person?
Very difficult. It's very difficult. Through many, many analogies. There's an entire book called the Book of Analogies. A sefer, a holy book called the Book of Analogies that goes through one analogy after another to try and give us the ability, give us the language to understand these things. And of course, they all bring us a little bit closer. But there is no complete understanding. There is no way to completely understand something that's not in our parameters. Hashem exists beyond all the tools that we use to understand anything. So the best that we can do is find parallels and make analogies and understand all the while that as much as we understand, we don't really understand. But one thing is, the important thing is not to let the details get us stuck. Yeah? The important thing is to understand Hashem's hand in creation. Yeah? And the more we focus on Hashem's hand in creation, the freer we are to do what we have to do.
Thank you.
Let's read the Alter Rebbe's words. It's a short section. We'll read the Alter Rebbe's words to Tanya.
That's so beautiful.
Okay. The second soul of the Jewish people is a veritable part of Hashem from on high. As it says in the verse, Hashem blew the soul of life into man. And we say in the davening, you blew the soul into me. As it says in the Zohar, the one who blows from inside of himself. That means from his inwardness and his innermost being. because a person blows out, he expresses his inward and innermost vitality when he blows with force. Kach, that was the first analogy, remember? Kach al derech mashal, here's the second analogy. Nishmeis Yisrael alu b'machshava. The souls of the Jewish people rose in Hashem's thoughts. Kid echsiv, this is already the third analogy, but the second and third analogies are actually one thing, as we saw in the Shari Kedusha from Reb Chaim Vital, that although physically medicine, science has already discovered that the reproductive material from which a child is conceived does not originate in the brain, but mystically that theory still holds true. And so Kabbalah maintained that perspective even after medicine had moved on. So that children come from the brain of their parents. And therefore these two line up nicely. The Jewish people are rooted in the thoughts of God, as it says, Israel is my firstborn son. It also says, Banim atam la'Hashem Elokechem, you are children of Hashem, your God. Pirush, just as a son comes from the brain of the father, so does every Jew come from the thoughts and wisdom of Hashem. That means from Hashem himself. If we're rooted in Hashem's thoughts and wisdom, that means from Hashem himself, because Hashem's wisdom is not like our wisdom. Rather, he and his wisdom are absolutely one. As the Rambam wrote, that he is the knowledge and he is also the one that knows, and he's also the ability to know, as is very different from every other being that has the ability to know. This is not something that humans have the ability to really understand. As it says, if we search for God, will you really find him? And when we come back tomorrow, God willing, because no time passes between one Tanya class and the next. When we come back, God willing, we will discover a fascinating debate between the Kabbalists and the philosophers, between the Maharal and the others, and the Rambam, and how the Alter Rebbe sorts it all out. Thank you very much for joining today, and